When Jesus was falsely accused of treason, Pontius Pilate gave Jesus the opportunity to face his accusers. During that sham trial, Pontius Pilate afforded more rights to Jesus than the Democrats have afforded this president in this process. I yield back.
The Gospels describe what Jesus said and what he did. They do not describe what he looked like. No hair color, no height, no eye color. For 2,000 years, artists have guessed. But one document passed down through the centuries claims to fill that gap. It was written not by a disciple, not by a believer, but by the Roman governor who met Jesus face to face and had to find words for what he saw. The governor. Jerusalem around the year 30 CE was a city carrying two worlds inside one set of walls. The sacred and the political pressed against each other every day, and the pressure was worse during the religious festivals when tens of thousands of pilgrims flooded into streets that could not hold them. The Roman prefect responsible for managing that pressure was a man named Pontius Pilate, who had arrived in Judea around the year 26 and understood his job in the plain terms that the Roman system used. Keep order, suppress threats, report to Rome. Pilate was trained to read people quickly. He had to be. The province he governed produced a specific kind of threat that Rome had learned to take seriously. Religious leaders who used theology to move crowds toward political action, speakers who could turn a festival into a riot before the soldiers had time to form ranks. Pilate had processed hundreds of cases. He knew what a troublemaker looked like before the man opened his mouth. One name came to him differently. The name Jesus of Nazareth reached Pilate's attention through channels that did not carry the usual signals. The reports were not about weapons or inflammatory speeches or calls for armed resistance. They described a man who gathered enormous crowds without promising war. A man who spoke about a kingdom without mentioning armies. A man who healed people without charging them, and who ate with the people that polite society would not touch. For a Roman governor trained to classify threats, that combination was harder to process than any straightforward rebellion. Pilate did not have a category for it. What he did have, eventually, was the man himself standing in his courtyard in chains, and whatever Pilate saw in that encounter stayed with him long enough that a document survived bearing his name and attempting to describe it. The letter. In the centuries after the death of Jesus, many writings circulated among early Christian communities that never became part of the New Testament. Some were letters. Some were stories about Jesus' life. Others claimed to preserve conversations, official reports, or eyewitness accounts from people outside the circle of his disciples. These writings are known today as the New Testament Apocrypha. While they are not included in the Bible, they offer a fascinating look at how early Christians remembered Jesus and how his story continued to grow. One of the most interesting of these texts is a document connected with Pontius Pilate. In different versions, it is sometimes called the Acts of Pilate, or linked to what later became the Gospel of Nicodemus. The text presents itself as an official account connected to Pilate, and includes details about the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. Other later writings, sometimes called the Letter of Pilate, even include descriptions of Jesus' appearance. The language is surprisingly detailed. Instead of speaking only in symbolic or miraculous terms, the writer describes Jesus as a real man with recognizable physical features. The description focuses on his face, hair, beard, and expression. It reads less like poetry and more like someone trying to record what they believe people remembered about him. The biggest question is whether the document can be traced back to Pilate himself. Most historians think the answer is no. The surviving texts were written centuries after the events they describe, and there is no reliable evidence that Pilate personally wrote them. They are generally seen as later Christian works rather than official Roman records. That does not mean they are without value. Many scholars believe these writings may preserve older traditions that had been passed down by word of mouth before they were written. Others think they simply reflect what Christian communities believed and remembered at the time they were composed. Exactly where those traditions began is still debated. What keeps these documents interesting is their level of detail. The descriptions are specific rather than vague. They attempt to describe a real person instead of creating an idealized image. In several places, the writer even admits that words seem unable to fully capture Jesus' appearance or presence. That sense of limitation gives the text a different tone from simple praise or legend. Whether these descriptions preserve genuine early memories or later traditions cannot be known with certainty. But they show that people in the early centuries of Christianity were deeply interested in one question that the New Testament itself never answers directly. What did Jesus actually look like? Even after 2,000 years, that question continues to capture the imagination of historians, artists, and believers alike. The hair and skin. The document describes Jesus' hair as having the tone of a ripe hazelnut, brown. It fell naturally over his shoulders and had a slight wave to it. It was not arranged in the formal style that some Jewish teachers of the period used, the kind of careful presentation that signaled status or authority through appearance. The hair of the man the document describes was not presenting itself. It was simply there, the way a working man's hair is there, without performance. This detail is significant for what it tells us about what Jesus was not projecting. A figure deliberately cultivating religious authority in first-century Judea had options for how to present himself physically. Teachers of the law were recognizable by specific markers. Holy men of various kinds had specific presentations associated with their roles. The hair description in Pilate's letter places Jesus outside all of those categories. He looked like someone who had not given the impression he made significant attention. The skin description carries the same quality. The document describes a complexion consistent with men who lived and worked under the Galilean sun. Not the pale skin of the Roman administrative class, not a complexion at either extreme. The warm tone of someone who had spent years walking between towns on dusty roads under a Mediterranean sun, who had worked with his hands before he began to teach, who was physically present in the world in the way that people who work outdoors are physically present. This is a description of a Galilean Jewish man in the first century. It fits what demographic and historical research tells us about the population of that region in that period. The people of Galilee at that time were a mixed population with roots in several regional ethnic traditions, and their physical appearance reflected that mixture. The complexion described in the document is consistent with what a realistic portrait of a man from that background would look like. The combination of the hair description and the skin description produces a picture that is specific without being remarkable. This is a man who would not have stood out in a crowd of Galilean men his age. He did not look the way centuries of European religious art has depicted him. He looked like someone from where he was from. The eyes. The eye description in the letter is where the document stops being a straightforward physical record and starts reaching for something it cannot fully name. The writer begins with what he can state plainly. The eyes had a specific color, but the description moves almost immediately from color to effect, because the writer seems to have found that describing the color alone was inadequate for what he was actually trying to communicate. The color was a starting point. What the eyes did was the thing that resisted easy description. The document attempts to capture a quality in the gaze that the writer found unusual enough to comment on specifically. The closest approximation it offers is a combination of two things that normally do not appear together: authority and compassion. Not the authority of a judge who has power over the person he is looking at. Not the compassion of someone who pities what they see. Something that combined them in a way that made the person being looked at feel something specific, not evaluated, not judged, but seen, completely seen, in a way that felt different from being examined. The writer was a Roman official. He spent his professional life evaluating people, reading them for threat or compliance or deception. He had developed the specific detachment that kind of work produces. He was not someone who would ordinarily be moved by a person's gaze or find it difficult to describe. The fact that he found these eyes difficult to describe is itself part of what the description is telling us. The Gospel accounts support this quality in a way that does not read like coordinated storytelling. The woman who had been bleeding for 12 years pushed through a crowd to touch the edge of Jesus' garment. When she did, Jesus stopped and asked who had touched him. The disciples pointed out the obvious. The crowd was pressing against him from every direction. The question seemed unanswerable. But the question was not about locating her physically. She needed to be seen. And Jesus stopped everything until she was. That pattern repeats in the Gospel accounts. Zacchaeus in the tree, the blind man shouting from the roadside, the woman taken in adultery standing in front of a crowd waiting to stone her. In each case, the person who needed to be seen was seen, specifically and completely, while everyone around them was focused elsewhere. The quality of attention the document's eye description is reaching for is not a physical characteristic. It is what the physical characteristics were an expression of. The beard. The document describes the beard as thick but maintained. The word the writer uses for maintained carries a sense of care without vanity, kept in a way that reflected something about the person's character rather than about his desire to impress. The document associates the beard specifically with a quality it calls serenity, not the serenity of someone who has withdrawn from the world, the serenity of someone who is fully present in difficult circumstances without being controlled by them. That quality shows up consistently in the Gospel accounts of Jesus in high-pressure situations. In the scene at the temple when the merchants and money changers were driven out, the action was forceful and deliberate, not a loss of control, but an exercise of it. In the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his death, the Gospel accounts describe genuine anguish. But they also describe a decision made clearly, without the paralysis that anguish usually produces. In the courtroom in front of Pilate, standing bound and facing execution, the accounts describe someone who answered questions without performing either submission or defiance. Pilate noticed this. His letter is trying to describe what he noticed, using the only vocabulary he had. The encounter. The morning Pilate met Jesus was early, before the city had fully woken. Jesus had been arrested during the night, processed through a hearing before the high priest, and brought to the praetorium, Pilate's official headquarters in Jerusalem, because the charges required Roman authority to act on. The religious leaders who brought him stayed outside the building. Entering a Gentile structure during the Passover period would have made them ritually unclean, so Pilate came out to them, then went back inside to conduct his interrogation. The interrogation is recorded in John's Gospel, with enough specific detail that scholars have used it to map the physical layout of the praetorium. Pilate goes in and out multiple times, moving between the crowd outside and the prisoner inside. He is managing two audiences simultaneously, trying to satisfy the religious authorities who want a death sentence, while also responding to something he is encountering in the interrogation itself that he does not know how to process. The man standing in front of Pilate was bound. He had been awake all night. He had been struck and mocked during his hearing before the high priest. He was about to be flogged. And he was answering Pilate's questions without any of the behaviors Pilate was trained to expect from someone in that position. Pilate asked him whether he was the king of the Jews. Most men facing execution on political charges would have answered that question very carefully, understanding that the wrong answer accelerated their death. Jesus answered the question directly and then explained what he meant. His kingdom was not of this world, and if it were, his followers would be fighting to free him. This was not a denial. It was a statement that reframed the entire category Pilate was using to evaluate him. Pilate came back out to the crowd and said he found no basis for a charge. He then went back in. He was trying to understand something, and the interrogation was not helping him understand it, because the framework he was using to conduct the interrogation was not built for what he was encountering. He asked what truth was. The question has been quoted for 2,000 years, usually as an example of philosophical skepticism or political cynicism. But in context, it reads less like a rhetorical flourish and more like a genuine moment of confusion. Pilate was a man who had spent his career in a system built on the practical exercise of power, and he was suddenly in a conversation about the nature of truth with a bound prisoner who was handling the situation with more composure than the free man conducting the interrogation. Truth was present in that room. Pilate could feel something he could not name. His letter is one of several pieces of evidence suggesting that the encounter stayed with him in a way that his other cases did not. The prophecy. The description of Jesus found in the writings connected to Pilate becomes even more interesting when it is compared with the Hebrew Scriptures. Whether or not the document preserves an authentic early tradition, it contains details that seem to echo words written centuries before the time of Jesus. About 700 years earlier, the prophet Isaiah described a mysterious figure often called the suffering servant. His description was surprising. Instead of speaking about a powerful king or a great military leader, Isaiah wrote that this person would not stand out because of his appearance. He would have no beauty or majesty that would naturally attract people to him. He would be rejected, misunderstood, and familiar with suffering. Many people would turn away from him instead of honoring him. That picture is very different from what most people expected the Messiah to be. The later writings linked to Pilate describe Jesus in a similar way. They do not present him as a man whose power came from his physical appearance. Instead, they describe someone with the ordinary features of a working man. There is no focus on royal clothing, impressive strength, or the kind of appearance people usually connect with kings and rulers. Yet the writer suggests that Jesus carried a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. This is where the comparison becomes interesting. If the description reflects an early tradition, it matches Isaiah's picture of a humble servant far more than the image of a conquering king. His influence did not come from wealth, political power, or military force. It came from something less visible, but far more lasting. Of course, historians continue to debate these writings. Most scholars do not believe Pilate himself wrote the surviving documents connected with his name. They are generally seen as later Christian texts that may preserve older traditions. Because of that, no one can say with certainty that the description records exactly what Pilate saw. Even so, the comparison raises an interesting question. Why would early Christians remember Jesus as an ordinary-looking man instead of giving him the appearance of a legendary hero? If they wanted to invent an impressive figure, they could easily have described him as handsome, majestic, or physically commanding. Instead, the tradition points in the opposite direction. Whether by history, memory, or faith, the picture remains remarkably consistent. Jesus is presented as someone whose authority did not come from how he looked. It came from who he was, what he taught, and the lasting impact he had on everyone who encountered him. The hands in the water. Pilate declared Jesus innocent 3 times in public. The Gospel accounts record the declarations explicitly. 3 separate statements, each one affirming that the Roman legal process had found no basis for the charges brought against this man. Pilate had the authority to release Jesus with a single word and the legal justification to do so. He did not. What stopped him was not new information. No evidence was produced during the proceedings that changed the legal picture. What stopped him was the crowd outside and the specific threat that the religious leaders deployed when they said that releasing Jesus would make Pilate no friend of Caesar. For a provincial governor whose career depended on the approval of Rome, that phrase was not a rhetorical flourish. It was a concrete threat. A report to Rome that Pilate had released a man the Jewish leadership considered dangerous could be the beginning of the end of his career. Pilate chose his career. He called for water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, stating publicly that he was innocent of this man's blood. The gesture was theatrical, and it was designed to transfer responsibility. It did not transfer anything. The declaration of innocence was recorded, repeated, and eventually embedded in one of the most widely repeated statements in Christian history. Billions of people recite the Apostles' Creed, which includes the phrase "suffered under Pontius Pilate." His name survived not as the name of a successful administrator, but as the name permanently associated with the moment he chose not to act on what he knew. The water did not clean what the letter could not describe. Pilate saw something in that courtyard that he spent the rest of his documented life unable to fully account for. What the face did. The document attributed to Pilate is evidence of a specific kind. It is the attempt of a man trained in observation and political evaluation to put into language an encounter that his training had not prepared him for. Whether the document is a literal letter from the historical Pilate or a text preserving what the early Christian community remembered about Jesus' physical presence, it captures something that the gospel accounts support independently. Jesus looked at people in a way that they remembered. The woman at the well in Samaria went back to her village and said the man she had met had told her everything she had ever done. What he had told her was specific and accurate, but the thing that the statement is pointing toward is not the information itself. It is what the information communicated, that she was known, completely known, not in the way that produces shame or the desire to hide, but in the way that produces the recognition that you have been seen, and that the seeing was not condemnation. The rich young ruler who came asking about eternal life is described in Mark's Gospel with a detail that is easy to read past. Before any teaching was offered, and before any command was given, Jesus looked at him and loved him. The man went away sad because the cost of following was higher than he was willing to pay, but the looking and the loving came first. The encounter with Jesus' gaze produced love before it produced instruction. Pilate's letter is reaching for this same quality with the vocabulary of a Roman administrator. The vocabulary is inadequate for the purpose. 2,000 years of religious art and theological writing have also found the vocabulary inadequate. The face that Pilate was trying to describe in the language of a governor's report is the same face that John, exiled on the island of Patmos decades later, saw shining like the sun in all its brilliance, and collapsed as though dead in front of. The letter and the vision are describing the same person, one from the outside, through the eyes of a man who did not believe and could not quite explain what he was seeing. One from the inside, through the eyes of a man who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, and was shown something of what that presence actually was beneath what the human form contained. Both accounts reach the same limit at the same point. Pilate could not fully describe what he saw. John fell down like a dead man before what he saw. The face resisted description from both directions because what it expressed exceeded the categories available to either observer. The question. Pilate asked. Pilate stood before the crowd and asked a question that changed history. "What shall I do with Jesus?" The crowd shouted back with its answer. Pilate gave the order, and Jesus was led away to be crucified. The moment ended. But the question did not. It outlived the crowd that cried for his death. It outlived Pilate's time as governor. It outlived the Roman Empire itself. For 2,000 years, people have continued to face the same question in one form or another. What will you do with Jesus? According to the Gospel accounts, Pilate publicly declared that he found no guilt in Jesus. Yet he still gave in to the pressure around him. He washed his hands before the crowd, hoping to separate himself from the decision he was about to make. The gesture became one of the most famous symbols in history. It suggested that responsibility could be removed simply by refusing to carry it. History remembers otherwise. Whether through the Gospels or the later traditions connected to Pilate, one idea remains the same. Pilate saw Jesus. He tried to understand him. He questioned him. He even declared him innocent. Yet in the end, he still had to choose what to do with him. The Gospels continue the story after the crucifixion. They describe an empty tomb and a risen Jesus who appears to his followers. What is striking is that recognition does not always happen immediately. Mary Magdalene stood outside the tomb and did not recognize him until he spoke her name. 2 disciples walked beside him on the road to Emmaus for hours without knowing who he was. Only when he broke bread with them did they finally understand. In each story, recognition came through something deeply personal, a familiar voice, a familiar action, a moment that reminded them of who he had always been. The Gospels repeatedly describe Jesus as someone who noticed people others ignored. He looked at the forgotten, the rejected, and the overlooked. He spoke with those others avoided. Even while hanging on the cross, he answered the plea of the man beside him, who simply asked to be remembered. Perhaps that is why the question has never disappeared. Pilate could describe Jesus with words, and later writers could preserve those descriptions, but no document could answer the question that every generation must answer for itself. History can tell us who Jesus was believed to be. Archaeology can uncover pieces of his world. Ancient texts can preserve memories of his life. What remains is the same question Pilate once asked. What will you do with Jesus? Pilate described what he saw but never acted on it. The Gospels reveal something deeper. Together they point to the same truth. Jesus was remembered not for his appearance, but for how completely he saw people. Subscribe. There is more in the historical record, and every account points further than the summary suggests.